Hello, everybody. Welcome back to this episode. Before we get going, in this episode that is really focused about the Canadian election. Why? Not really science, but I missed the election, obviously, living abroad, and wanted to talk about it. So I enlisted the help of two friends from back home in Alberta, and we just had a chat about the election. But before we get to that, remember, why carry around a poster tube if you're going to a conference? Check out featherposter.com. Use the code 2BRAD at checkout. Get yourself $10 off a really nice canvas poster. Very easy to fold up, easy to pack, easy to travel with, looks great, doesn't crease. You'll be a hit at your next conference. A big hit. So don't forget featherposter.com. Please do check it out. And if you're going to purchase, use the promo code 2BRAD, TWO Brad, all one word. Right. So, this episode, like I said, not science, politics, specifically Canadian politics. So it's a bit inside baseball for people listening outside of Canada. But, Canada, the world, the Western democracies all kind of facing similar political climates at the moment. So we talk a little bit about that, but some specifics that you might need to know if you're outside of Canada. We have parliamentary system. We have the Liberal Party, which is the incoming Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who you've probably heard of. That's his party. We have the Conservative Party, which is sort of center-right, whereas Justin Trudeau's Liberals are center-left. Those are the two big parties, the only two parties that have ever formed government in Canada. We then have a few smaller parties, the NDP, which is a little more left of center. We have the Green Party, which I think everybody knows what that's about, environmental issues. And then we have the Bloc Québécois, which is a regional party that represents Quebec and is been the Quebec Separatist Party. So they're also in play. And we had a new party that you'll hear about, led by a guy called Maxime Bernier, which was very right. This was the sort of anti-immigration, climate change isn't real party. So it was an interesting election. Apparently there was a lot of mudslinging. It was a little dirtier than Canadian elections generally are. Climate change was obviously an issue. And some of the interesting things that played out in the election was a couple scandals that faced Justin Trudeau. You probably heard about the blackface scandal, pictures emerging of him in blackface. That's not a good look. And then also one specific that we talk about that might not be that known outside of Canada is called the SNC-Lavalin scandal. Just a brief note on what that is, so you can follow along. The SNC-Lavalin is a giant engineering company. They got caught bribing officials from Libya, so they were under investigation. The Attorney General of Canada had the choice to prosecute this company, which would mean fines and potentially job losses in the voter-rich areas of Quebec. Or she could have done what was referred to as a deferred prosecution, so kind of more of a slap on the wrist, but it would have saved the jobs, is the argument. So the Prime Minister's office apparently was caught trying to pressure her into going with the deferred prosecution, and she said, no, we think there's grounds to prosecute. And she taped some phone calls after she felt that she was being unduly pressured by the Prime Minister's office into going with the other options. So some unethical influence into the justice system. And there was a commissioner's report, ethical commissioner report. It's not a criminal offense, but they basically said it doesn't look good and it's not great. And probably behavior that goes on in a lot of different governments, but to get caught for it is not great. So those are the main things. And then we did touch on Western alienation in the end of the podcast, which we might have to cover in a whole nother episode because it is pretty interesting. In brief, again, the western part of Canada has not as many seats, so they tend to feel alienated already. So they can vote in mass for a party and still not get power. And we are also in the West, the resource rich area, and specifically oil, And really right now, the only part of the country that is not doing good economically because of dips in oil prices and inability to get new pipelines built to ship that oil to harbors. And so again, these provinces that produce this oil, provinces around them are saying, we don't want your pipelines coming through here. And yet, for the longest time, the oil-rich provinces have been the economic engine of the country. They pay into an equalization scheme that pays other provinces money to help keep everybody on an equal playing field. So by doing that, paying that, long being the economic engine, everybody using gas and oil, and then feeling like nobody actually wants to help you out when your economy is turned down, is leading to some really big sentiments of alienation and even talk of separation, which is kind of silly, but again, that's for another discussion. That should get you up to date on all of this if you want to join in on the conversation about the Canadian election. We did it over Skype. The audio is not the best, but I hope you do enjoy it. If you're listening, like I said, if you're listening outside of Canada, maybe it's a peek into what's going on. The two guys I spoke to, Steve and Scott, are really smart guys. Both studied this in university, politics and business and whatnot. So yeah, just really good commentators on this kind of thing from a sort of everyman's perspective, but a rather informed everyman's perspective. So that's it. I've rambled on enough. Here's the episode, a little bit of the freak motif, as always, to bring us in, and then a little politics chat. Be a little difficult to all try and respond to comments at once, but let's just give it a go. So I'll just start. So, seeming's how there was a Canadian federal election and I was not there, and I know one of my guests is itching to comment on my lack of voting, but we'll get to that. I decided to get two friends who are living in the province of Alberta to join me on a call here just to get a little bit of their take basically on the federal election, how it went down, what they think of the results, what they think moving forward. So I guess we'll start. I'll introduce my two good friends of the podcast. Scott Stoley is here with us. Scott.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, really good. And Steve Barg, who is... Hey. Yeah, I think, Steve, now you've been part of every single podcast project I've ever put together, so you're 3 for 3, buddy.
That's pretty tremendous, isn't
it? It really is.
I don't know why you're calling me.
Well, for your hot takes, Steve. It's it's just your hot takes. And so let's start then there with you, Steve. Again, like I just mentioned, I wasn't there and I saw the campaign from afar. And, I have some thoughts on it, but I'd like to let's start with you. Your thoughts just on how the race was run. There was some comments in some of the media outlets that it was a particularly dirty, nasty, kind of shitty election to be a part of. Was that your perspective? Are you happy with the outcome? Did anybody, blow you away? What do you think?
Well, no, and I'm going to come off as a bit of a curmudgeon here, but no, I don't think it was particularly dirty. I don't think any of the parties did a particularly good job. I don't think any of the leaders did a particularly good job, and we're left with what we're left with for now, a Liberal minority government. I mean, you could say this, you could chalk this election in my mind up to basic incompetency with, from the two basic perspectives. From the Conservative perspective, we had a prime minister who was going out of his way to seemingly make a fool of himself at every turn. And they still couldn't do anything with it. And from a Liberal perspective, you have a prime minister who's presided over a really good economy with historic lows in unemployment and all this. And you'd have to think, well, to not get a majority government again, he would have to make a fool of himself, around every corner. And he did do that. So they both failed tremendously. And I'm just looking forward to all of the names of the major parties. Me never having to hear their names again. That's my perspective.
All right. So, yeah, a rather salty one. Scott Stoley, what say you?
I think I feel slightly less salty than Steve, but probably not that much less salty. I think one of my frustrations in the campaign was it seems that the parties were more interested in talking about how terrible the other guys were as opposed to what they were going to do, and often on a personal level, as opposed to, Justin Trudeau's a bad guy, Andrew Scheer's a bad guy, as opposed to Justin Trudeau has bad policies or Scheer has bad policies, which would be at least better in my mind. Or best case scenario to me would be, here are all our policies and here's why they're the best. But not a lot of focus on that. I think all the parties were quite willing to basically lie about the other party's positions, I think, in order to some kind of scare tactic stuff about how, Scheer's going to cut $53 billion and Justin Trudeau is going to legalize all drugs. So overall, I found it to be a pretty dishonest campaign. It would have been nice to see a little more positivity in terms of here's the good of what we're going to do, as opposed to here's why the other guys are so bad. So yeah, that was probably my main takeaway from it.
Scott, did you have a single issue that was sort of most important that you were hoping was addressed, or was there an issue that was addressed? I know climate change initiatives seemed to be a bit of a battleground, and seemed to be what a lot of pundits were saying after the election, that this was kind of the deciding thing, and that, basically it says that all parties moving forward, you're going to need a good climate strategy in order to win elections going forward from this point. Agree with that, or was there another issue that you thought could have been addressed, should have been addressed, or was addressed that influenced the way you felt about the parties?
No, I think as a left-leaning Albertan, it put me in a funny position that I would say the issues, climate change was certainly probably the biggest issue for me, because I think it is a real serious problem going forward, and we need a credible plan to address it. I also want them to get pipelines built, so a bit of a contradiction there. But as an Albertan, I think it would be, crucial to our economy here. And I think there's some sort of disinformation about how a pipeline could still fit into our sort of climate strategy. I think you are right that it really cost the Conservative Party to not have a credible plan. And certainly much of the expert analysis that I read was basically saying the Conservative plan was mostly kind of hand waving and dreams, as opposed to credible actions. And certainly, I think the Liberal stance on the carbon tax, really helped earn my support, in that a carbon tax to me is the Conservative way to mitigate climate change. It allows for essentially free market solutions, essentially just price it and then let the market figure out what's the best way to reduce carbon. Whereas the Conservatives' plan was largely about regulations, which also are costly, and all the experts would tell you are going to be costlier than a carbon tax, but it's more politically popular because those costs are hidden, as opposed to the carbon tax that you just see on your gas bill. But I think seeing how the Conservatives didn't win in much of anything in any major urban centers outside of Alberta and Saskatchewan, I think that lack of a climate plan, a credible climate plan, definitely hurt them there.
Mm-hmm. All right, Steve, what do you think? What was your issue going in, and was it addressed? Did you feel your concerns were being looked after?
Well, with just to touch on the climate uh, plans, because I think that is obviously kind of a top three issue that everyone was talking about. Yeah, I think that like the liberal carbon tax makes a lot of sense. I don't quite understand where I guess that money is being funneled. If it's between, it seems like they might be stuck between like a revenue neutral plan or investing in green technology. I guess part of that is up to the provinces too, I think, because of the tiered system they have of carbon tax going on. But I think like the Conservatives could have scored huge points by having a plan. By having, I mean, like let's be honest, their platform was released after people could start voting. I mean, so that's and not just with the carbon tax, like their costed platform was released after the advanced polls opened, which is, I think, I mean, if you're going to hit a deadline, it might be when people can start voting to release your platform. That might be a good idea. I think the Conservatives could have scored huge points. I don't know if they just lost the pulse of the entire nation or if they failed to look at an electoral map before the election, but they could have scored huge points by saying, look, here's a carbon tax. We like the idea of a carbon tax. It's actually a conservative idea, especially if it's revenue neutral. But we're not going to ramp it up so fast right away. We're going to take a moderate approach to the carbon tax. And we're going to roll it out over a longer period of time, increase the tax over a longer period of time so as to not negatively affect businesses in the short term. And I think they could have scored huge points that way. I think people would have said, they would have been able to gain a lot more traction out in Ontario and in the Atlantic provinces. And they just failed to do it. I don't know, like when I'm looking at these elections, I got to be honest, the thing that's so frustrating to me is that really the only issue that is being talked about in terms of like a long range view of things is climate change. But that is like one of many issues that we're looking at in the future. Nobody talks about AI. Nobody talks about automation. That's barely even talked about. Our healthcare system was pretty well largely ignored throughout the election. Like nobody seemed to care about that. So, which I mean is basically in danger of falling apart over the next couple decades. Nobody talks about that. So climate change, yeah, of course, people talk about that because it's like it's a fairly trendy issue. And I'm not trying to make light of it. I know it's serious, but it's an issue that's people take extreme views on, and nobody's talking about anything else. And I mean, the big thing that I'm looking to for climate change is someone to talk about, the thorium-based nuclear reactors. Nobody talks about that. So why, like, I don't know. The issues that are talked about are just so basic and so dumbed down on both sides that's really frustrating to me. No one's talking about a lot of the real issues. So no, I'm very unsatisfied. I don't know if that's what you're asking.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess what the saltiness continues. So
that's right.
Yeah. Fair enough. And I think that's an important point, and that would like maybe be the next one is, it did seem that there was a lack of substance in terms of policy discussion. And then, Steve, you're saying here that climate change sort of dominated the thing, but and I think it's a fair point that you make that there is other issues. Climate change may be a big one, but there are other issues to deal with. My question then is, or my thought that I'll put to you guys, and you can whoever wants to jump in on it. But how much, why was there such a lack of policy discussion, and does it fit in with the sort of what we see in other countries, where a lot of rhetoric and stuff is getting ramped up, and especially our neighbors to the south in America, where issues don't seem to matter. It's more about personality, and especially in our parliamentary system, where we're not even really electing the leader. Have we lost the plot? And did Canada maybe kind of survive this test of mudslinging rhetoric kind of thing, or are we just slipping further into that?
I can maybe jump in there. I think in part the lack of substance is just it's a trend in our society generally, globally, that people's attention spans are shorter. We're used to information comes 280 characters at a time. People, get half their information from memes. It seems it's hard to really engage people on the details and kind of the nitty gritty aspects of particular policies, though it's certainly out there if you're looking for it. I think there's kind of a group of Canadian economists on Twitter who kind of jokingly call themselves the Economist Party, but they did some really good detailed work on the costing of the different platforms and the distributional effects of different policies. For example, how the competing liberal and conservative tax cuts would affect different segments of society across income and that sort of thing. So that sort of detailed information, I think, is out there generally, or at least got out in the case of the Conservatives, got out there eventually when they released their platform with a week left. But I think that's definitely part of the problem. You talk about our parliamentary system and have we lost the plot? And I think to some extent we have, as certainly the political science major in me, when I hear, Jagmeet Singh says he's going to reopen a hospital in Vancouver, and all I can think is no, or in Winnipeg, sorry. But no, you're not, because that's provincial jurisdiction. And or when Andrew Scheer says whoever gets the most seats gets to form the government or gets the first crack at forming the government, no, that's just not actually how it works in our Westminster parliamentary system. So I was certainly a bit disappointed that I think these gentlemen know better. Generally, every time they're sort of mentioning these policies or ideas that aren't actually in their jurisdiction or don't actually reflect how our system works, it's not because they don't know. It's because the political cost that you pay for misinformation or, essentially outright lying is virtually nothing these days, compared to, I think, probably helped by Mr. Trump down south, that things have really gone. I think there was, maybe I'm just thinking of a golden age before I was alive, when if you just brazenly lied and got caught, there would be political consequences for that. And we don't seem to see that to the same extent, that I think all the parties lied about all the other parties. So we certainly lost some of the plot that way, in my view.
Steve?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the discourse is it's just at a base level. And yeah, there's lying. I think there's always been lying to some extent. I don't know. There's definitely, Scott, you pointed to a couple of examples, and that's, yeah, they're caught in it. And I think our media does like a decent job of catching people in those lies. But then again, CBC got itself stuck in a lot of mucky kind of ground when didn't they sue who is it, the Conservatives partway through? Or
they did, yeah,
for taking a clip of their news program and tweeting it out.
Well, I think what it was is that they took a number of clips and were using them in a larger ad, and the CBC said that they were misrepresenting the facts that were being displayed in those clips in the larger pieces that they took from. I didn't understand it much, because it's like, isn't that public? The CBC is a public broadcaster, and if they broadcast something, aren't you allowed to then use it? But I don't know.
Yeah.
So yeah.
it seemed very odd that the public broadcaster, which does skew liberal in many people's eyes, at least, would do something like that rather than just cover it as a political story, like is their job. So I don't know. Yeah, the discourse is pretty poor. Nobody really wants to think about too much. People just want to choose sides and agree with them. That makes them feel really good to do that. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's going to change. Like, it would be great to have a little bit more substance. Particularly, we looked at the debate, and there was really only one English language leaders debate, and it was like a debacle from every viewpoint. So maybe like a long form interview with candidates, would help. I don't know what you do. Yeah, it's just not great. Like, and I think it's up to the voter. Like Scott, you said, you can tune into all sorts of different people who are going a little bit deeper with things, but how many people are doing that? I'd say less than 2% of all voters are actually digging into real details.
Yeah, I think you're very much right there in that, what is the source of this sort of clickbaity lack of depth in our coverage? And I think it's a result of just consumer demand that you write, long form pieces about the distributional effects of this tax credit, and people aren't going to read that.
No.
With shrinking attention spans and that sort of thing, it's a lot easier to show a meme that, shows the other guy in shadows and says, he's going to take your money, but not me. And I think it's a lot easier to get your message across that way, even if it's, lacks nuance or is partly or wholly inaccurate or.
Mm-hmm. So I think maybe what we're hearing here is that, Steve, you want more thorium nuclear power plant memes.
That's right. Yeah. If we can get some thorium nuclear power plant memes.
Oh, and then the other party's definitely going to release a bunch of memes. It'll be Andrew Scheer, the Chernobyl reactor, and this is what Scheer wants for you, or something like that.
Oh no, they would steal clips from the show Chernobyl and get sued by HBO.
That would make more sense to me, if HBO wanted to sue for use of their clips. The CBC, that was bizarro world to me. As someone who likes the CBC, my thought was, what the hell are you doing?
I don't think HBO's even suing Trump, are they? Trump loves to use Game of Thrones memes.
I think there's been a number of cease and desist things on
you got
some of the music.
Cease and desist orders.
Yeah, well.
All right. Well, I don't know. The idea that, I don't know, it struck me a little bit, Scott, in some of the things that you said there, because it's like, yes, we point to the social media and stuff as being, kind of driving this lack of attention and stuff like that. But then at the same time, there is a lot of information out there on those platforms. You mentioned these professors or economists or whatever that were providing this sort of service. So I'm not sure, exactly which way it goes or how it goes. But it seems like that there could be, as much as we demonize it, the answers could be there. But how do you get people to tune into it? I don't know. And I don't know if that's obviously not something that we're going to be able to figure out right here. Before I wanted to get some thoughts on some of the smaller parties as well. But I'm thinking again, just in terms of me living abroad here and following the campaign from afar, and then seeing some of the international coverage of it, which, let me tell you, it's not a lot. I don't know if this is going to be news to you guys, but not a lot of people outside of Canada really give a shit about what's going on in Canada, except when the elections, when the results came through and it was Trudeau, there was a lot of pieces that were saying, Canada made the sensible choice and didn't fall prey to the right-wing populist sort of movements that are sweeping across some of the other places, Western democracies, we'll say. What do you make of that? And on the ground in Canada, like does that seem like that was the choice or the mood? Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a little bit ridiculous in some ways. Scheer would have been a very vanilla candidate. He would have been a very boring prime minister. He's not a populist guy. Like, I think there's a big time intuition to brand anybody who's a right wing party leader as the next Donald Trump, or the Canadian version, sorry, of Donald Trump. Sure, I mean, he was a huge mistake just because of his ambiguity on his stance on LGBTQ and abortion and all this. That clearly hurt him, and there's no way that a party's gonna take control of the government with those types of without clarity, in those areas. But he would have been so boring. There would have been it wouldn't have been any rise of the alt right or anything like that. It would have just been all boring all the time. And it would have been fine because, I mean, really, like, the two Canadian parties are both really centrist parties. Neither of them are very far to the right. I mean, you could have said that if somehow Maxime Bernier got some traction or something like that. No, that was our quote unquote populist party. Mm-hmm. He went nowhere, and rightfully so. He didn't even win his own riding, and I think the guy the Rhino Party candidate, which is a joke party that just mocks the election. It's just like a parody or whatever, or not a parody.
A satire.
It's a satire party. They ran a guy named Maxime Bernier to go against Maxime Bernier in his own riding. They just found a guy with the same name, and he picked up quite a few votes on the real Maxime Bernier. And they were just trying to, have fun with the fact that they might be able to confuse people into voting for them, or maybe people would just think that's funny and vote that way. And I think a lot of people did. So no, I don't think there's any worry about that. And I do think that makes sense that would be a part of the international coverage, because everybody wants a story, and maybe that's a story maybe to somebody living in Europe, but there's no there. It's nothing. That's not actually
even though you could say that the Conservatives do have those elements in their voter base, and maybe one of the criticisms that I read of them and Scheer, along with his ambiguity on some of the abortion and LGBTQ that you mentioned, was that he doesn't do enough to call out that segment of the group. And it's possible that Maxime Bernier was trying to get those people to vote for him, but maybe they just didn't see him as a viable candidate. Yet there's still that segment of the, and I mean, I don't know what the answer is here. I'm just pointing that out. And is this where that comparison is coming from?
If I could jump in just on Bernier, I think I was quite happy that the People's Party, formed and ran on essentially a right-wing populist platform, and then got 1% of the vote. So it really, you're right, it did show Canada rejecting this sort of right-wing populist movement. I think efforts to paint the Conservative Party with that same brush, to me, are pretty misguided. I think Steve is right that we would have got a pretty centrist, middle-of-the-road, sensible government either way, though, certainly Scheer could have done more to disavow the sort of extreme far right, I won't call them Nazis because we're not, call everyone a Nazi these days, but there is certainly a bit of an extreme element. I mean, Scheer's campaign manager was also, strongly linked with the Rebel media, which is very much in that right-wing populist, branch. I think it's easy for Canada to say, look at us, we didn't go down that, that road, when we have a, essentially a booming economy, not so much here in Alberta, but countrywide things are going very well. And we also don't share any borders with large countries that are significantly poorer than us. So it's a lot easier to, say we have this rose-colored view of immigrants and whatnot when we don't have any of the sort of problems that you would see in Europe or in the southern United States or that sort of thing. I'd also be curious to see to what extent we would call this a rejection of the People's Party and sort of that far right thinking, and how much of it is simply as a result of our first past the post system. A lot of people might be thinking, yeah, I really do, those kind of ideas are for me, but they don't have any hope of winning in any riding outside of maybe Bernier, and even he couldn't win. So I would have been curious to see if we had, say, a strict proportional representation system, how much more support would they have received? They certainly would have got seats in the House of Commons, and then maybe the narrative about Canada rejects, right-wing populism would have been a little more muted. Though I was pretty sad. I had high hopes for Bernier because Bernier came out in the Conservative leadership. His big platform was getting rid of supply management, our system that essentially inflates the price of milk and makes dairy farmers rich at the expense of the rest of us. And it's getting rid of sort of corporate welfare, all the loopholes and that sort of thing. And I was like, yeah, I'm with you, Maxime. And then it kind of switched to, and don't you hate immigrants and think climate change is a load of crap? I was like, oh, no, you kind of lost me there. But it's too bad. I had real high hopes, but then they certainly, and maybe it helped that if they could sort of siphon off some of those elements from the Conservative Party, even in small numbers, probably helps the Conservatives image-wise, because all the real extreme folks have decided to go, to the next party over.
All right, then let's move to the Liberals, I guess, and Trudeau himself, because Steve, as you mentioned, he did everything in his power to make himself look like a foolish dum-dum. And I think that's a narrative that not a lot of people outside of Canada get. He gets hailed as this progressive leader and all that. And the scandals that came up, obviously the blackface one being the most shameful, I guess, did get some coverage outside of Canada. I did see it in the news outlets over here, but not much. So as much as we've just kind of said the Conservatives have an image problem and whatnot, what do we make of this, and how much do you think it hurt the Liberal campaign? And also, again, with the idea of, I kind of lost my thought there, but they could have ran this thing on the economy and the success they've had, but how much of this, sort of this, they've thrown their lot in the other side of the, full-on progressive, maybe a bit of virtue signaling, that kind of thing. So did people reject populism, or is there another story here in that they maybe got a little sick and tired of, the hypocrisy that looked to be coming out of the Liberal campaign? What do you think? What do you make of this? I guess from the perspective of Trudeau himself.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to kind of untangle with Trudeau. I think the bottom line for me is he's, as a leader, he's a wee bit vapid, I suppose I'll say.
That's probably a really good word for it.
I don't think he's the sharpest guy around, and I don't even mean that as an insult. I just don't think he's like one of these people who rose to leadership with a bunch of wily and smart, shrewd moves. I mean, basically, we first kind of were introduced to him through a boxing match where he punched a guy. And, it's and then he fell down some stairs and right into the prime minister's seat. So he's, I just think that he's that guy. That's our prime minister. So, there's a lot of hypocrisy with him. I mean, there's lots of very kind of delicious and rich examples of hypocrisy with this is, pardon me, his stance on, the Me Too movement, and his demotion of Kent Hare, and then months later the magazine article or the newspaper articles brought to kind of the public eye of him having a real problem with groping as a 30-year-old. And, when it was someone else, his stance was, doesn't matter how old you were, doesn't matter if it was 10 years ago, it doesn't matter if you misunderstood the situation. It's whatever the woman says is kind of what goes. It's like, okay, well, if you're saying that, you sure as hell can't have a thing in your past, an actual published newspaper article. And here's this is tangential, but what is wrong with the Stephen Harper smear team? Like, all of this stuff is coming up now. Like, how could have there been a published article on a groping of a female journalist? How, a published newspaper article and blackface in the yearbooks. Anyway, I digress. He's got a real problem with, he didn't even mention SNC Lavalin, which is, to me, like, if you want to talk about his ethics or corruption, that is where the central case is. It's not even necessarily with his weird blackface or his, handsy nature. Based on a newspaper article. I don't know. That's just what I'm based strictly on a newspaper article. He's painted as being a bit handsy. So
it's all true, yeah.
But SNC Lavalin, again, that shows his hypocrisy because he empowers a woman, and the first thing he does is he makes sure the cabinet is half man and half woman. So he wants to empower women. He puts a woman in this position of power of the justice system. Also First Nations, he's checking all of his diversity boxes. And I think she was I'm not saying that's why she got that job, Jody Wilson-Raybould. I think she's very qualified, but I think that's probably a part of why he appointed her. Yeah. And so then he, when the SNC bribes the people with the Montreal, call them whores, I guess, then he wants to change the law, so, well, can't be that bad, can it, to, bribe some people with some Montreal hookers. And then she says, well, no, we're not going to defer the prosecution. And then he says, well, of course, we know the story. He says, well, yes, we are. And he leans on her and she says, no. And I think in a lot of governments, that type of stuff might happen, but we would just never hear of it because people fall in line under the prime minister, and whether or not you think that's corrupt, it's obviously corrupt, but I think you'd be silly to think it didn't happen in a lot of rooms, a lot of backdoor rooms, and a lot of prime ministers through history. So she stands up. She says no. She's obviously very empowered in her position, and her position is one that should have autonomy. And he got himself into a big mess there. I think if he had a different way of running his party, and he had if he wasn't so concerned with this so-called quote unquote virtue signaling, then people may have fallen in line a different way. It might have happened differently. We may not even know about this kind of thing. So he's a big mess. I know that it's very difficult to kind of unravel the entire ball of yarn with this particular individual. I think he's But I think bottom line, you could simplify it with just saying, he's a little bit of an airhead.
Yeah, I think there's probably, in my view, there's probably some parallels between Trudeau's first term and Obama's first term, and that they kind of both got elected on a wave of like change and hope, sunny ways, as the Liberals like to refer to it. And then kind of the cold, hard reality of politics kicks in, and then there's some disillusionment that comes obviously with Obama and the drone strikes and not being able to pass certain legislation and that sort of thing. And people got a little more cynical and disillusioned, though I do think Obama's a genuinely really smart guy, and that Trudeau, I mean, I have no real problem. I don't hate the guy by any stretch, but he's vapid for sure. He is a drama teacher playing a role every time he is out in front of the cameras. He is whoever he needs to be that day. And I think, but certainly was elected on this idea of sunny ways and change, and we're going to do things differently. And then the SNC-Lavalin scandal really kind of, at least to me, showed no things, the sunny ways aren't quite so sunny. The kind of old-timey backroom deals and favors given to preferred companies and preferred individuals, none of that really changed. So I think there's certainly some cynicism, and the blackface stuff is just so hypocritical. And for him to kind of, his answers on it sort of made it seem like, it was everyone's fault and that it's society's fault. It's anything except, how was a rich kid from Papineau supposed to know that dressing up in blackface was pretty horribly offensive to a lot of people out there? And so I think his response to it was very much, vapid, absolutely. Though, Steve, you pointed out, where was the Harper kind of black ops people? My thought when the scandal came out was like, oh, Conservatives, your timing is way off, because people's attention spans are short. And if they were sitting on this, if I were them, I would have released it a week before the election. And then it's really fresh in people's minds. Whereas if it came out a month before the vote, and by the time the vote rolled around, nobody was really talking about it anymore. So then again, on the flip side, for a lot of folks, if those sort of, say cultural sensitivity issues or virtue signaling, if that's important to you, are you going to vote for Andrew Scheer instead? Probably not. So you'll probably hold your nose a bit and still vote for Trudeau, especially if you're in a competitive riding where you think it's going to really make a difference and no one else has a shot at winning the seat. Then you're probably going to say, as much as I don't like what he did, I would still prefer to have him in power as opposed to, Andrew Scheer and his arguably old-timey backwards views on abortion and gay marriage and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a funny one to watch from abroad, to be honest.
Even from abroad, it was interesting to me. I've been following Andrew Yang, the kind of universal basic income candidate in the United States for the Democratic primary. Mm-hmm. And so I find him a really interesting candidate. He's got really interesting ideas and that sort of thing. But he, after the election, just tweeted, congratulations to Justin Trudeau for winning. And he got a whole slew of responses saying, how could you possibly say that? You're losing my support. Don't you know this is the blackface guy? And I wonder how much internationally he's just went from sunny ways guy, and that's the only thing people know about him, to, oh, he's the blackface guy, and that's the only thing people know about him.
I think it probably depends on the where you're getting your news source, because I'm sure that like right-wing sort of Trump supporting media in the US jumped on this as like, look at these people are, hypocritical, and that's why progressives suck and blah blah blah, all that. But if you're somebody in Europe, let's say Germany, where you see sort of the right-wing parties that are, pretty extreme, starting to gain some traction in the continent and whatnot, you're gonna look at that story very differently and be like, yeah, well, he said sorry, he made a mistake, this kind of thing. But I think that was probably to be expected.
Well, sorry, put a last thought on that. The issue with that is I don't think is public perception around the world or at home. I think the issue with the blackface and even other things like his embarrassing trip to India, um, the where that hits home is not a public perception, but leaders around the world that now have to deal with this guy. Like, let's say you're, a leader, a world leader from like an African nation or something, and you're sitting across the table dealing with someone who is a blackface guy. Let's say you're the leader of India who, wears a suit to his meetings with world leaders, and the Canadian leader comes up with 4 different costumes of what he thinks it must be like to be an Indian person, like and the guy likes to dress up, like we all know that. I mean, we saw him dress up like Superman one day when he released the budget. I mean, this guy is he's a vapid dress up guy. So I mean,
he's still a drama teacher at heart.
Well, they range from okay, that's a good costume. Like, all right, good. That would play well at a Halloween costume. But you're at work, to blackface.
Yeah, it's true. But I guess, I mean, and this is kind of what I've been thinking about of all this too, and what I was talking about a bit earlier about, like, how our system, we don't normally elect the leader, and we elect we're supposed to. The system is designed to elect your local representative that best suits your local, concerns, and they're part of a party. But it seems like more and more that the leader is becoming the sort of the focal point and what people are voting on. And in this, like, moving forward, I wonder, how much discussion the Liberals are having in terms of, do we need to get this guy out? Like, he hung on and won a second term, but the fact that it's all of this stuff has just come out. So I don't know. Do you think could you see minority governments generally historically have lasted on average about 2 years? So in 2 years, if we're at another election, are the Liberals looking for another leader?
Personally, I would say no. I don't think they're. I don't think, because in the one part, I suppose you might say, if you're the Liberals, you're going to say, look, he had this horribly corrupt blackface or SNC thing, and he, blackface that would have destroyed so many other politicians, and he kind of just skated on through it all. Look at this guy, he's Teflon. So that would be one way you could look at it. Obviously, you could also say he's got a great economy and still didn't manage to win a majority. But I don't think they'll be looking to move on anytime soon. Certainly, you put so much stock into a guy, and with only, say, an average of another elections coming in 2 years, you want to present 2 years of a united front of getting things done and working for the people and that sort of thing. And I think the sort of ugly infighting of a leadership race from the Liberals' perspective would not be well served to their to their electoral interests, which, forget the right thing, I think most parties are worried about what's going to be good for us in the next election. And I don't think moving on from Trudeau is going to be in their best interest, or at least they're not going to perceive it to be in their best interest, whether it is or not. Also, just, you'd mentioned talking about the fact that we elect our local MPs and they're supposed to, they ultimately represent us and we don't actually elect the leaders. But I think in Canada, it's certainly been this way, that you're essentially voting for a party. And I think it's been that way for a long time, since Canada has kind of some of the most strict party discipline of the Westminster systems in the world. So you look at, Brexit right now, they're part of the reason that things are a mess, or Boris Johnson couldn't do what he wanted, is because 22 members of the Conservative Party voted for the rule that required them to kind of seek an extension. And in Canada, you just don't see that. For the most part, parties vote along party lines consistently, so it really doesn't matter who the individual in your riding is. It's the party line that's going to matter. So even if, for me personally, I think if there was a guy that I liked better, but was less inclined to agree with his party, then ultimately I'm going to vote for the party.
Right, but then the leader should also matter less, and maybe this is a situation too where people can be, not a fan of Trudeau as a leader, but would look at the party and say, well, that's the party that I'm most aligned with. Anyway, Steve, you said you don't think they're going to be moving on with him either.
Oh, I said I hope not. I don't know what they're gonna do. Like God knows what they're gonna do. I don't really get the party dynamic. Like that's not. I'm definitely no expert, but no, I think the fact that they gave up a majority, they now just have a majority. The fact that they lost the popular vote, and and with what should have been a very successful few years of governance, I think it's a massive failure. And I think if they are looking at it like, well, we'll just work together for 2 years and then, we'll get our majority back. Like, what do you think in the next 2 years, Trudeau's going to all of a sudden become smart? No, it's going to be more shit. There's going to be more blackface. There's going to be other costumes. There's going to be other things happening. And all the Conservatives have to do, I swear to God, all they have to do is put in, say, Rona Ambrose, who's, someone who's thought of as being highly competent. Having a woman as the head of that party would do wonders for them. And all they have to do is stop worrying about the extreme right side of the party. I don't know why they still do, but they could easily trounce Liberal Party led by Justin Trudeau in 2 years. It would be like that wouldn't shock me at all to see a Conservative majority if they march Trudeau back out there. So. It's a lot of ifs, but for me, I think that the obvious choice is to, for the back room part of the party to start thinking and planning on how to stab that guy in the back. And I think if they're smart, the next leader would be Chrystia Freeland. I'd love to see that. So
yeah, me too.
So yeah, we'll see. But my position is that they should give it a shot anyway to change leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. We're getting close to the time limit that we have here, but I wanted to just get thoughts on the sort of other parties. How they did. The NDP seemed to lose seats. They did get, I think, a pretty good percentage of the vote. Like in terms of their popularity seems to be, holding at least, even if they didn't win more seats. And the Green Party as well. I saw a breakdown of what the election would have looked like if we had different electoral systems. And the big winners would have been the Green Party and the NDP. We also got to mention that the Bloc Québécois also seemed to have had a resurgence, and they won a number of seats. What did you think of them? Those briefly, how does it change the dynamic moving forward? And then we can just wrap it up and see like what are you expecting? What are you hoping for in the next 2 years? What are the issues you're hoping this minority parliament is able to address? Who wants to start? Scott, you want to
go? Yeah, sure. I think the NDP, I would say they frustrate me because in many ways they're probably my ideological home. Like I'm pretty far, I'd call myself a democratic socialist on a lot of issues. But so I would say we share a lot of the same goals in terms of a more equitable society and those sorts of things. Problem is, I think their execution is terrible. That they often have the Economist Party doesn't seem to be a big fan of a lot of their ideas because they're just not economically sound ways of getting to the sort of goals that we share. Say like their idea Jagmeet Singh floated the idea of a wealth tax, which has been tried and abandoned in many European, much more left-wing European countries, because they realized, much as it sounds good, take it from the rich people, it's just not a smart way to do it. I think Jagmeet Singh really acquitted himself well. I think I quite like him personally. I think he seems like, a genuine smart guy who cares. But in the end, I suppose he survived through this simply because the expectation was they were going to get absolutely destroyed. And then they picked up steam near the end and managed to not get completely destroyed. So I guess he cleared the very low bar. I think the Green Party, quite similar. I like a lot of their, environmental initiatives and that sort of thing. I think we need to have more focus on the environment and maybe make some short-term sacrifices for some long-term benefits. But again, certainly a lot of their actual economic policies and their fiscal policies ranged between unconstitutional and insane. Like, they were just not well thought out from an economics perspective, from a constitutional law perspective. So as much as I'd like to support the Green Party on their environmental stance, I think they really need to get their house in order on a lot of, on everything else, more or less. And I think the Bloc really got lucky that Scheer is very unpopular in Quebec. There was, the NDP has sort of lost ground. I feel like they were sort of maybe just a fallback option, that people said, I don't like any of the rest of them, so I guess I'll just vote for the Bloc and promote Quebec's interests. So that's probably my thoughts on the smaller parties. And the People's Party. If we could just have a government that gets rid of supply management, I'm all for this. And sadly, the only party that had that in their platform is the party that also, has some pretty grimy elements that I don't agree with.
Mm-hmm. All right, Steve?
So basically, NDP was able to claim victory even though they lost a bunch of seats. So that's, I guess, somehow Jagmeet Singh he won even though he lost. So congrats to that guy. Another social media, darling. We'll see if he makes it. I have no idea. Green Party, they're the same party they've always been, even though they've seemed to have got some kind of traction with national, at least as being a part of the narrative, as being mentioned as being a quote unquote major party, which they're not. They'll never have a chance to form government. The most they can hope for is to be a part of some greasy coalition and stuff like this. So to me, they remain largely irrelevant, but for their, ability to spew a bunch of extremist nonsense for the most part, and to get some attention for themselves that way. I mean, Elizabeth May is an interesting person. I think she's already said that she'll be stepping down before the next election. We'll see what direction they go in. And the Bloc Québécois is, they had a weird bounce back. But again, the proportion of seats that they got is very strange to me, based on the number of people who actually voted for them. That all makes no sense to me. And I think that actually allows me to transition into the final thing that I'd like to talk about. And I'm not sure if this is your final question, Brad, about the Western feeling of Western alienation. I think it definitely needs to be talked about if we're going to have a podcast. So anyway, this is now there's a Western Canadian separatist movement that's making the rounds. They call themselves Wexit.
Pretty bad name.
Terrible name. And these are people who are obviously fed up and frustrated and all this, and they may not have this isn't a logical move. This is a emotional move for them, and I think it's a temporary one as well. But they do have some good points, and one of the points that they have is the disproportional amount of seats in certain places in this country as opposed to the Western provinces. And you can really feel it when they call the election before a vote is counted in Manitoba. The election was already called. So, that's, and the Conservatives got a tremendous amount of votes. And the western part of the country is what allowed them to get more votes than any other party. So that's worth something, but it turns out it's really not. And there's a lot of frustration out here, and I feel it too. Like there is a lot of ridiculous policies that seem to take the view that Ontario and Quebec are the main part of the country and everything else is kind of auxiliary to that. So look for more noise on that. I think the most sensible amount of noise will be made when it comes to equalization payments rather than an actual separatist movement. I think one of the things that Kenney said he was going to do is he was going to hold a referendum on equalization payments. I don't know what they can actually do with that, but I think there's going to be a lot of talk about that, at least around these parts, for the next few years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the aftermath of this and the Western separation movement and all that almost deserves probably its own podcast, which I'd love to do. I think some of it seems like they maybe with some of the rhetoric and the not backing down, that Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta, and the Saskatchewan Premier Moe have done, it kind of left them with these people with no other option now. Like the last card to play now is the separation card, which I think is a terrible idea. And yeah, the movement probably won't go. But it does open up the question of electoral reform, something Trudeau said he was going to do and then quickly abandoned. It definitely I don't know. We'd have to go through all the different options and see what would make sense. Like I said, in the brief scenario I saw where the CBC kind of outlined a few different other popular forms and what that would mean, it basically wouldn't change much. Wouldn't have changed the results much. The Conservatives would have had a small minority, but really the big winners would have been the NDP and the Greens, and the Bloc would have lost in most of the scenarios. But yeah, electoral reform, the NDP have talked about it, but I don't think the Liberals are ever going to want to touch that. Scott, what do you think moving forward then, and if you have any thoughts on the Western alienation?
Yeah, certainly I think the Western separatism movement is just fundamentally silly, that if your main complaint is you can't get a pipeline built, well, separating is clearly not going to help you one bit on that front. I don't think it's in any way serious. It's never going to happen. Most of the people claiming to support it, I think, are doing so somewhat in bad faith. They don't really believe the ideas. But I think as far as Western alienation goes, here's the problem why Alberta always feels they don't get listened to. In Alberta, you'll commonly hear, Quebec always gets pandered to and we don't. It's totally unfair. But here's the thing. Quebec, their votes are up for grabs. They'll vote for different people. Whereas in Alberta, we vote for the Conservatives robotically each and every time. So then they have no incentive to try and pander to Alberta. If they're going to vote for you no matter what, then what's the point of trying to, listen, get their issues at play? That's why I thought it was so silly that for the Conservatives not to go more serious about climate change, or say a carbon tax. There would have been a great amount of gnashing of teeth in Alberta if the Conservative Party said we're pro carbon tax, but we would have voted for them anyway, and they would have got more votes in Ontario and Quebec. So it would have been a smarter strategy. But I think until Albertans realize that, we're never going to get anywhere by voting for the same party robotically, no matter what, every time, then you're not going to get your issues listened to. I mean, with all the complaints about equalization, Jason Kenney was a cabinet minister when they approved the equalization formula. The Conservative Party was in government. No pipelines were built at that point either, really. No major projects like that. So I don't know how you do it, because it's certainly not as if Alberta is going to start voting for the Liberals or the NDP en masse, I don't think. Although if there was maybe some sort of unified left alternative that didn't have all the baggage of the NDP or Liberal names, it might actually be able to make some hay in parts of Alberta anyway. But I think the Western alienation is very real, as much as the solutions proposed are silly. The sentiments are real, and people are really angry. And I think equalization and, of course, the pipeline issue is ultimately going to be a real test for Trudeau. I mean, it amazes me the extent to which people here think, Trudeau hates Alberta and hates the pipeline when they bought the pipeline to keep the project alive. I think he's honestly trying. But and it's the courts and whatnot that are holding it up. But I think there's a limited understanding of that around here, as far as a lot of people are concerned. The only reason the pipeline is not getting built is because Justin Trudeau is the prime minister, which is wrong, but it's still people's perception. So they're going to have a real, and I mean, they bought the pipeline. I don't know what else they can do to try and change that perception, but they're definitely going to have to do something to kind of ease the tension around here.
Yeah, I wonder, because they Trudeau, at least in the days right after the election, did say, like, it is a priority. We are going to move forward and get it done no matter what. And so if he does do that, that you would think that that's probably going to be a top priority. It should be a top priority for them in this 2 years to at least stave off, a confidence vote or some kind of fall of the government. How that works with the other parties who are opposed to it, I don't know. But yeah, it'll be interesting. And I think I agree with you there, Scott. A lot of this stuff is misplaced anger, at the federal government for not getting these things done, when people, forget that the guy who's in power in Alberta now signed off on these decisions and wasn't able to do the things that they're all screaming about now. So I put some blame at the feet of the leaders that are kind of stoke this misplacement of the anger. And then there's also there's a lot of other issues that go into it. But I know you guys got to run, so it was a quick one, but I really enjoyed it. I think we should do this again if you guys are down, and we could pick another topic. Maybe Western alienation or electoral reform is another good one. But
absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks both for doing this, and we'll do it again. Steve, thank you.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks for having me again.
Oh, always. I love your saltiness.
I look forward to being a part of your next podcast project.
All right.
Whatever it might be.
Yeah, thanks, man. And Scott, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
All right, man. Okay, well, I will talk to you guys both later. There you have it. Hope you enjoyed it. For the Canadians, tell us what you think. For the non-Canadians, also tell us what you think of boring old Canadian politics. Anyway, it was a federal election, and I'm a bit of a political junkie. I like to talk, obviously, and so I wanted to do that. And again, my thanks to my two guests, Scott and Steve. Had a blast. I think we might do some more of these, so tune in, I guess. Don't forget to check out featherposter.com. Use the promo code 2BRAD, TWO Brad, if you're interested. And I think that's about it. Thank you all, as always, to the Freak Motif and to Sebastian Aboud. Follow us on Twitter at 2Brad for you, and Instagram at 2Brad for you. I'm at bvanparadon. And subscribe, like, comment, or all of that stuff boosts our profile, so help us out. If you got the 10 seconds it takes to do that, it would be great. And we'll catch you next time. Thanks again for listening. Bye.